First, let's start with web application. Okay, using Spring MVC, you can build a web application. Spring MVC will help you to build web app, a dynamic web app you can create, which is having both the front end and the back end. Okay, Spring MVC providing library support for building web application, particularly for controller part. This module is for controller and view. Okay, between view and controller, it will help you. Okay, this MVC module will help you to build views and controllers. What after that? The remaining we are implementing with different other modules, business layer, DAO layer. So far we discussed for DAO, JDBC template, ORM, right? So this is particularly for controller part. We understand controller responsibility, right? The controller responsibility in MVC is it should able to read data which is coming from view. Let's say if you have form, your controller should able to read data which is coming from front end. It should be able to read. So once you read data, server side validations if you want to perform, maybe here you can perform backend side validations or server side validation stuff that you can do here. In case if you want to verify email format is correct or not, mobile number formats are correct or not. If you want to do validations from server side, both from front end and back end, we can do these validations. You can perform validations in the controller also, because controller is the first class which receives data from front end. If you receive bad data, you better handle that here itself. You better reject that data. So read data, do server side validations, and finally from here you may send it to next layer, send it to next. Finally it should able to send a response also back. Response. Finally it should able to send response back. Response back to view. First it will read data. If you want to perform any server side validations, you can perform. And from here we will send it to next layer, service, DAOs. Once we get response back from service, we should send response back to view. So these are the major activities that we are doing in controller. So far we have implemented one SMS application, EMS application. There also we have returned controllers using @ controller. But reading data, server side validations, or sending response, we are not doing it directly from controller. We have taken help to do these operations from a servlet, something registration servlet we have implemented. There we are reading the data and doing all this stuff. Because as I told you, if you remember, If you want to read data which is coming from front end, always definitely you need a servlet. Without a servlet, we can't read this data. But in Spring, whichever at the rate controller annotation given, that annotation given for to keep it on controller, and your controller should be able to do all these operations. So what I'm telling is without servlet, we can't read this data. And again, I'm telling you, you have to perform all these operations under at the rate controller class only. Then how it will work without servlet? Yeah, without servlet it will not work, but you are going to use a predefined servlet. You need not to write like registration servlet for employee. If you see the last two applications, we have implemented servlet classes to read data. We give an action here in this form like dot slash registration and the method post with the post method from the form, and we have implemented controller classes, I mean servlet classes. From here, remember servlet is different and these controllers are different. Okay, without servlet it is impossible to read data which is coming from front end, that is for sure. Yes, yeah. So in both of these applications, if you see, we have implemented a controller class, which means servlet. Just a minute. First, we are reading data in this web class, right? To read data from front end, first we have written servlet class, and we understand servlet class object is created by Tomcat. Implemented this from HTTP servlet, and to read data which is coming from front end post method, we implemented do post method here and reading data. Then from here we are forwarding data to actual Spring control, which are implemented using at the rate controller class. But actually this class should be able to get this data directly. Whatever data you are reading, right? This class should be able to do that directly without this servlet. If you use MVC, you can avoid this servlet class. Without the servlet class, this read operations, then sending response operations, you can perform directly from this control. Okay, how we can avoid that servlet means you have to use a predefined servlet class here. To avoid your servlet, you need to use predefined servlet. What actually the servlet which you returned doing here, you implemented a HTTP servlet. This servlet class actually what it is doing, here you have one front end form index.html. Here you have form fields, name, email address, and this is the action, and the method is post. Whenever you click on this register button, this action will generate and it will forward name, email address, field values to this action. Okay, this is the action. Let's say if this is a postal card, this is the address for it, to address. Okay, so I'm writing a letter to this address. So this address will be verified under web.xml file. Do somebody have registered on this address or not? Okay, it will find this address is registered here to a servlet. For this servlet, the servlet class is registration servlet. So whenever you click there, it will visit this class. What we have in this class? This class is starting tasks which I implemented in this class. In this class, I am starting IOC container first. At first, I am starting IOC container. At first, I am starting IOC container. At first, I am starting IOC container. Okay. As soon as you submit your data based on your form, if it is a post like speed post, it will execute do post method. If it is a get, it will execute do get method. So this is the address. So the data will be carried here. So here you can read that data using this request object. You can read this data. Finally, you will be sending response. So how many tasks we are doing here? Starting IOC container, one task. Second, reading data from front end, second task. Third task, here I would able to call my Spring classes, right? Using this application context dot get bean, I can able to get Spring classes also. Get next Spring class to execute. This is also I'm performing here using this application context IOC object. I'm calling my controller class get next Spring class to execute. So from here we are calling, if you see, controller dot post executing Spring implementation or Spring class. Then finally sending response, sending output. These all tasks performing here, right? Your controller class is able to start IOC container inside servlet class constructor. We started it because this class will start by Tomcat. Hereafter, your IOC also should start. Let's say if you take a big factory which is having so many machines, to start that factory there will be a main switch. That main switch will start all the sub engines, sub motors, everything to start the entire factory machines. Same way, Tomcat will execute servlet. Hereafter, the servlet is executing or starting your IOC container. And during configuration class execution, we started Hibernate container also. So one by one in a chain, every container is starting. So first servlet class is helping here to start your IOC container. This is the first major help that is doing. Hereafter, it is helping you to read data from front end, and it is helping you to execute the next classes also. This class performs only read operations, validations. It need to send data to next, right? So definitely we need help. So using application context dot get bean, we are getting next Spring classes to execute. Okay, that is also providing. Finally, after performing all this, I need to send output. So to send output also, it is helping using out.println. It is helping. Now, if I avoid this servlet, and if you use a predefined servlet, is that predefined servlet going to help similar way? Is that predefined servlet can it able to start IOC container, and will it able to execute next Spring classes? Will it able to help you to read data from your controller? Will it able to allow you to send output? All these qualities your predefined servlet also should have. So Spring provided one predefined servlet to achieve almost similar features. So the servlet class name is dispatcher servlet. We use a predefined servlet class here, dispatcher servlet. Rather than we implementing a servlet class every time, we just configure dispatcher servlet in our web.xml file. This is predefined implementation. You need not to implement this class. This is a predefined class. Predefined class. This is predefined class. This class is already there in your library. In Spring MVC or Spring Web jar file, we have this dispatcher servlet predefined implemented servlet class. So if I use this class, almost I can achieve same thing. It can able to start your IOC container. It can help you to read data, and this class obviously will forward data to your controller, whichever method you provided in the controller, and it help you to send the response back to view also, but it will work in a different way. This is a predefined servlet, right? Not intended for a particular form. This is intended for every form, every kind of task it can able to perform. This is a generic a class which can help you for every task. You create a simple view for read operation, write operation, get or post or delete, whatever HTTP method, any kind of tasks you can have from your front end. All your front end tasks you can redirect to dispatcher servlet first. From there, dispatcher servlet will handle all your operations. So this is the main route. Via dispatcher servlet only, every request will be forwarded from front end to back end. Even in Spring Boot also. Even if you implement microservice application also. Always dispatcher servlet will execute in between your front end and back end. Such a key class this dispatcher servlet is. Such a key class this dispatcher servlet is. Do I need to implement this class? Means nothing. You need not to implement it. It is a predefined class. Just you should understand how this class is helpful to you. You need to understand how this dispatcher servlet class is helpful to you to carry data from front end to your controller part. If you understand that, done. You will understand how to use dispatcher servlet. Okay. So basically, let me explain you architecture. Okay. You may have so many front end forms. Application means not a single view. It may have lot of views. So you may have a number of views. Front end form 1, 2, 3, lot of front ends you can have. While using Spring MVC particularly, okay? When I submit data from this front end, any view, straight away the data will go to dispatcher servlet. That's how we configure dispatcher servlet. For every view, either it's a registration page, login page, or ordering food, or adding item to cart, or checkout page, whatever you implement, read employees data, generate payslip, whatever form it is, whatever front end it is, whatever task you are performing front end, when you submit it, first directly this request should go to dispatcher servlet. Always, always. There is no other alternate. So always your request, front end request should go to dispatcher servlet. While using Spring, okay, Spring MVC, you have to configure it. You have to configure it. Developer need to configure it. Developer should configure it. Configure this class. Web.xml file. In web.xml file as a developer, you should configure this. You should configure this. In web.xml file, you should configure this. For which URL pattern? Earlier, for simple registration form, we implemented one registration controller. But I don't know how many forms I may have in my application. The application may have a lot of views, 100 views, 1000 views, million views you can have. Any number of front end pages you can have. All front ends should come to dispatcher servlet only. Means URL pattern should allow every request which is coming from front end. Star means every request. Any request or any request which is coming from front end, it should allow. That's how we configure URL pattern. In URL pattern, we don't simply put slash registration. If you put slash registration, it will allow only registration. Instead, if I put star dot star something, it will allow everything, a simple expression. So for every request, you should configure dispatcher servlet in your web.xml file as a developer. But if you are doing application in Spring Boot, this entire predefined configuration they given, you need not to do any configurations. Spring Boot, you know, right? Less configuration framework, less configuration. Developer can relax, you know, from the lot of configurations. So many default configurations given in Spring Boot. Such an advanced framework Spring Boot is. Okay, just we are in Spring only, Spring module only. Here I am showing you all the configurations, manual configurations. In the last session also we did Hibernate configuration, and that Hibernate configuration we are reading from at the rate configuration class. We did the configurations. Okay, but in Spring Boot you need not to do so many default configurations given that we will discuss later. So here you should configure a servlet class which should execute for every view. That's how you should configure it. What next? And this is a predefined class. Where do I read data? This is a predefined class. You need not to edit it, or you should not change it. And how this will function? If I submit data from here, I have some registration form or I have some login form here. I want to read that data to perform the required operation. Dispatch inside dispatcher servlet, you need not to do it. Dispatcher servlet is saying whatever tasks you want to perform, registration data you want to read. Let's say if it is form 1, for this view, write one controller class using @controller. Write controller class here with @controller. @controller. Write a controller class with @controller, and you can able to pass this data via dispatcher servlet to your controller. Whichever operations earlier you are doing in controller, directly you can do it in controller class now. All powers dispatcher servlet will provide to controller class now. Earlier we don't have such powers. We are reading data from HTTP servlet implementation class only when we are doing all this here, starting IOC, all this. But now dispatcher servlet is saying what? Dispatcher servlet will start your IOC container. It will get the data which is coming from front end, and it can able to forward to your required controller class. Now you can perform that read operations here. Read operation and send it to next layer. From here, sending to next layer is simple to us because we auto-wire the next class. Just read data from front end, read view, send to next layer, and finally send response to view. Finally, you can send response to view. These three tasks you can perform under your at the rate controller only. Who will start IOC container? Without IOC container, I can't get this controller object, right? If you see here, how servlet, this registration servlet got your controller object using application context. IOC, it is calling get bean and getting the controller. Same way here, dispatcher servlet will start your IOC. It will start IOC. Just a minute, please. Hello? ఒక్క నిమిషం 508 ఒకటి కట్ అయింది. యా 175 కూడా కట్ అయింది. 170 కూడా 175 వచ్చింది. ఓకేనా? ఓకే. యా. Yeah. So who will start IOC container? Earlier, when you started registration servlet, there you are starting IOC container. Now this responsibility will be taken care by dispatcher servlet. You need not to write this logic. Here we return logic to start IOC container. But now you need not to write the similar logic implemented in dispatcher servlet. So starting this IOC responsibility will be taken care by dispatcher servlet, which is predefined class. Whenever you start your application, server like Tomcat, immediately dispatcher servlet will be executed. Dispatcher servlet will start your IOC. Let's say you guys implemented employee management system using Spring. Then you deployed and you started your application in Tomcat. Immediately Tomcat will do what? There will be only one servlet class in your application, dispatcher servlet. It will start that dispatcher servlet class first. And immediately it will start your IOC also. What IOC will do? IOC will create objects for all your backend classes, whichever controller, service, DAOs, configurations you implemented. And it will wait for the front end request. So if you load one front end page and if you submit request, straight away that request will come to dispatcher servlet. Already dispatcher servlet started IOC, and for your form, it will identify controller. Basically, you will have lot of controllers in the backend. Lot of Spring controllers, Spring service classes, Spring DAO classes, configuration classes you will have. Which class particularly it should execute, dispatcher servlet can decide. We will do configurations additionally for that. To decide for front end, which controller need to execute it. I have front end here, but which backend class need to be executed? That will be configured in our Spring XML file or via annotation mapping. Front end to view to controller mapping we do in our Spring XML file. If it is XML approach, if it is annotation, using annotation also we can map it. There is a request mapping annotation, using that one we do it. So front end to your controller class mapping will be done under Spring XML file. You know Spring XML file will be read by your IOC only. Obviously, right? Spring XML files are reading by IOC only. So as soon as you start your Tomcat, I started my Tomcat. Tomcat will create dispatcher servlet object. From here I'll call it DS. Okay, dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet create IOC object. You started Tomcat. Tomcat will create your dispatcher servlet object. Dispatcher servlet will create IOC object. And when you submit view, when you submit view, first this view request will go to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet will forward it to you, your @controller classes. Your @controller classes. Before this @controller annotation, we used to have programmatic approach. Without this @controller, programmatic way of controllers also we used to implement, but those are outdated. So when you submit your view data, dispatcher servlet will forward that data to @controller class. How this dispatcher servlet knows that this view data need to go to so and so particular controller? It will get that information from your Spring XML file only or via your annotation. So these two tasks, starting IOC container and executing Spring class, sending it to next class right here. It is sending data, name, email address, data, whichever we are reading in servlet class, we are sending it to controller class, which is basically @controller class. So these two tasks, important tasks, starting IOC container and sending data to your controller will be taken care by dispatcher servlet. Earlier you used to do that, now you relax. Dispatcher servlet will do that for you. Why they have given such a servlet class? Means instead having dispatcher servlet, if they allow you to write your own servlets, you may or may not properly start this IOC container, right? As I know how to keep it inside this controller servlet class constructor or maybe via init method, I may properly implement it, properly close it. As a framework should make things simple. So instead, you starting this IOC container, sensitive logic, right? Instead, you doing it, if they can provide a predefined servlet class, if that can do the tasks whichever you are doing, which is very sensitive, you can relax, right? And there is no chance that we can do misconfiguration because it's a predefined class. Properly they have added or properly they are starting IOC container with no mistakes. Apart from that, using a lot of servlet classes are not recommended. If Spring allow you to write your own controllers only, you may write lot of controllers for every view. Here you may have thousands of views. For thousands of views, you may write thousands of servlets, but really not required that many servlets. One single servlet is enough for any number of forms. Here in our use case, we have a registration form. We created one servlet. Maybe if you have some login form, you may create login servlet. If you have XYZ form, you may create XYZ servlet. Keeping that many servlets is really important means nothing, not required. Though you use a number of servlets or one servlet for multiple tasks also, it will give same performance because servlets will work in a singleton multi-thread model. No harm using one servlet for multiple tasks. But when you use one single servlet for multiple tasks, lot of code you need to write there. See, for each method I have written if else, if else, if else. Lot of code redundancy might happen here. Lot of confusion also it might create here on your own way if you write your servlets. In case if you want to customize, if you don't want dispatcher servlet, you can implement like registration servlet class. But you need to perform lot of tasks, a lot of conversions. Instead, you doing it, dispatcher servlet can make things simple. One single servlet class, you can just configure it. Instead, you starting IOC container, dispatcher servlet will start. Instead, you forwarding data to your controller, dispatcher servlet can do that for you. Your front end data it can forward to controller. So from here, controller can forward data to next layer without any question. Finally, when you give response back, to dispatcher servlet, dispatcher servlet will forward output to you. Controller need to give response back to dispatcher servlet on. Dispatcher servlet will forward that same to view. I hope you understand high level what dispatcher servlet is doing and what your controllers are doing. I'll give you detailed architecture. Between this dispatcher servlet and this controller class, there are some helper classes here to help. In other words, you can imagine dispatcher servlet is taking help of some helper classes. For what purpose? As this is a single class, it might have lot of logic, right? Instead writing that lot of logic in a single class, they have divided or they have used some helper classes to keep logic separately for each kind of task. So when you submit data to dispatcher servlet to know which controller should execute, of course this information it is having from this XML file. First, when you submit data as a step 1 here, the data will come to dispatcher servlet. And already dispatcher servlet got data during start itself. Just a minute. So during starting itself, it is reading this data. It have all the mapping details, front end to back end. Your view to controller mapping details we have in XML file or via annotation. So dispatcher servlet have this information. So when you submit data, dispatcher servlet will take help of handler mapping class. There is a class name called handler mapping HM. I'm just giving shorthand HM. So this dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping when you submit step 1 request, right? Step 2, what it will do? Dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping. What it will ask? It will ask handler mapping. Which controller do I need to execute? Let me mention it too. As a second step, this handler mapping will be executed. Dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping. Which controller do I need to execute? Then handler mapping will give details of so and so controller. Your application may have a lot of controllers. For view 1 controller, view 2 controller. Like that, you may have multiple controllers. So when you submit a request to dispatcher servlet using the help of handler mapping, it will identify which controller should be executed. So finally, the request will go to controller. So controller will do all the required operations and it will give response back. But here the response we will give it in a different way. While sending response, right? In servlet we were using out.println. That is not allowed here. Instead, we will submit here. Controller will send response in the form of model and view. Model means a map object holds output information, and view which holds view name, response page name. So finally, your response will be composed in the form of model and view, not out object. We used out object, right? Out.println, not allowed. Instead, we use model and view. Model and view we will use to send a response. So when this model and view response will be received by dispatcher servlet from controller, again it will take help of one class to understand from where do I need to fetch this view. Just view name only. If you see here, clearly observe, view name we will send. Just view name we will send without any other information. Means the location of view, or either it is a JSP page or HTML page. We don't provide any information from controller. For that purpose, one more helper class required here when it send response back as a fourth step in the form of model and view rather than out.println. Dispatcher select needs help. So here we use help of view resolver, VR, shorthand name VR, not virtual reality, view resolver. It's a view resolver. So this view resolver will help dispatcher servlet what is the location of this view. Okay, particularly for this view, right? View name from where this view need to be collected will be provided by view resolver. View resolver will tell dispatcher servlet about your view name, what is your view location and what is your view extension. Everything will be given by view resolver. So based on that, dispatcher servlet will forward response back. Finally, the response will go back to the requested user as a step 6. This is how front end to back end to front end request flow will happen. Are you guys able to understand? Feeling complicated? Clear, right? Yeah. I'll implement an example. You will clearly understand it. Okay. As we went through servlet already, I don't think you will have much confusion. Right? I'm just comparing this to the servlet whichever we implemented before. So I think it must be clear. Maybe in interviews, interviewer might ask this question regularly. Explain MVC architecture. You should able to explain it. So you should able to explain it in the same way. We will configure multiple views to one single servlet class, which is a dispatcher servlet, and we can call it as front controller as well, because this is executing always first, right? We can call it as front controller also. Basically, this is front controller design pattern. They might ask which design pattern it is. You may say front controller. Dispatcher servlet is a front controller, and the design pattern is front controller design pattern. This itself is a DP design pattern. Having one single servlet for multiple requests is a front controller design pattern. So you can explain this. When we have multiple views, we configure one single front controller, which is a dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet will take help of handler mapping to understand which controller should execute. Once controller give response back in the form of model and view, dispatcher servlet will take help of view resolver to identify the view page location, means the folder names. In web content, there you might have a lot of folders, JavaScript folders, image folders, HTML folders. So that location you should give, and extension, like is it .jsp or .html. There are a lot of front end view types. So view resolver will tell view location and view extension to dispatcher servlet. Finally, it will give response. Simple. Dispatcher servlet will get data from view. It will take help of handler mapping to identify controller. So the request will redirect to controller. Controller will execute all the next operations. Then it will send response back in the form of model and view. To understand view location, which is sent via model and view, we will use view resolver. So it will identify location and extension, and it will forward to user. End of the day. Simple architecture. And what a dispatcher servlet will do, it will start your IOC. It can start your IOC. Otherwise, how we can call controllers? We can't. It will start your IOC. Yeah. Init method. Hmm. Which one? Dispatcher servlet? Yes, I believe. If you configure load on startup, during startup itself, it will start everything. Otherwise, at first time user request. Okay. There is a chance, right? Servlet may start at first time user request if it is a lazy one. If it is a eager one, it will start at the time of server start. Same like your bean classes. While we were using bean factory, your beans were created at the time of calling that particular bean. But while using application context, it is creating all the beans at the time of loading time itself. Okay. No confusion in that. Okay. Either it start during server startup or either it start during first request. No much difference. Okay. Yeah. I'll give example tomorrow. Okay. Even if I start also, it will confuse you this mapping and the example both. Okay. So I'll give you example. Then again, I'll explain you architecture with a good pictorial representation. I believe you understand this. Still, we will have one more discussion. Okay. After example. Okay. By aligning with these steps, right? I'll create example tomorrow. So you'll understand how dispatcher servlet is functioning, how to write controller, how you will return model and view, how we will send output pages to front end, how we read data in the front end. Okay, we'll see step by step. Then we'll conclude MVC tomorrow. Okay, I'm not going to give you programmatic examples. If you want, you can go through them. 6 examples I have given. But in my opinion, if you have time, just load them and execute and see how they are functioning. But mostly you need to focus on annotations. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it for today.